We're going to do the shiur today, this lecture today, on the subject to catch a killer from Parsha Massei. This is partially adapted from some of the context that the Rebbe would have brought down, as well as some of the sources from the sages, as well as adapted from the title from Retribution and Revenge from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who's the chief rabbi, was the chief rabbi in London. Let's first go through the cities of refuge, a review. Sometimes this becomes quite mundane for you because you might be an expert and know everything about City of Refuge, but I just want to give an overview about the City of Refuge before we get into the context of this lesson called To Catch a Killer, a lecture from Parshas Massei. The 6 cities of refuge were located in different areas of Israel, so that there was a reasonably easy access for any person in the state of Israel to get to if they were to accidentally kill someone. The southernmost city was the closest one to Hebron. The northernmost area was near Kadesh, which was between the present-day city of Safed and Haifa, and the city of Shechem was in the center. The 3 most cities that were chosen at roughly the same latitude on the side that were on the other side of the Jordan. The routes to the cities of refuge had to be easily gotten to, meaning if there was any valleys that needed to be crossed, any rivers to forge, they would have to make straightway paths for them to get to. You'll understand the whole process in the end of this when we get to it. It had to be an easy way to navigate to the city of refuge. That means valleys had to be raised, hills need to be leveled. It needed to be made in such a way that that individual can get there with no problem. All the crossroads had signs that would indicate the city. Distance and mile markers had to be placed. Very important, because usually when a person is running for their life, they don't have time to go do a Google search or MapQuest to find out how to get out of there. Each city needed to be an average size, located in a populous trading center point, and also have to have their own water source. Why do you think they have to have their own water source? So they wouldn't have to leave the city, because if he leaves the city, what happens? The person can be killed. So additionally, the cities also provided refuge for a majority of the population, which had to be non-murderers or killers per se. And there was an established court of law in that city, meaning they had to have a base din in the city. If the general population fell to a number in which the number of people were in there because they had killed somebody, and that they had lost they potentially could lose their court, their base din, the Kohanim and the Levites had the responsibility to go in and repopulate this city. Additionally, the cities the number of cities given were how many? 6. And then how many additional cities were the Levitical cities? 48, correct? Which made a total of, come on, mathematicians, where are you at? 54. So 54 cities totally. Yeah, all of us like, I didn't think we was going to have a math class in this thing, right? So the interesting thing is every one of the Levitical cities were a city of refuge, to include 6 additional cities. That's the best way to look at it. Why was that important? Because the Levites were at such a righteous and holy status. The idea that a person that would be in such a desperate strait, that he'd be alienated from friends and from community and family, and to end up going into sort of a strange town where you don't know anybody, that the priest had this responsibility of spiritually nurturing this individual and protecting this individual, making sure that their life was not to be taken. In addition to these cities of refuge, you remember, and we just read this in the text, that there was a 2,000 cubit area that surrounded the city, which meant that the person could leave the walled gates, but had to stay within that 2,000 cubit measurement around the city. Now, at the end of this Torah portion, we encounter the law of the cities of refuge. These cities east of the Jordan, and later 3 more within the land of Israel itself, were put there for the purpose of one who had committed homicide or killed someone and could flee to find protection until their case could be heard in a court of law. Now, if they were to be found guilty of murder, in a biblical times they were sentenced to death. If found innocent, they could be taken into the city of refuge where they couldn't be touched by a family member. The question that has to be asked is, what is the difference between killing and murder? Killing someone and murder. What is?
One is unintentional.
One is unintentional and one is intentional. Very important place to see, to understand. The idea of a city of refuge was to protect against revenge as part of a thing called the Goel Hadam, which means the redeemer, the blood redeemer, or one who would redeem for the blood of his relative. Usually this would be a close relative or a family member or friend who had been killed. Homicide is never less serious in Jewish law. There's a fundamental difference, as we've said, between murder and killing, and that is the deliberate taking of a person's life. To kill someone not guilty of murder is an act of revenge, for an accidental death is not justice, but further bloodshed, and must be prevented. The whole idea of the cities of refuge was to not pollute the land. And we're going to see that there is a very direct correlation with what God says about not polluting the land, and He's talking about the spilling of innocent blood. So for one to take revenge, even though the law says that if I knew someone, for example, a close family member, and I find out somebody killed them, and I don't know it was accidental, I had no idea it was an accident, but out of revenge I immediately killed them, that would be a crime of passion, and the law would deal with you differently during that time as well as today, correct? However, if I knew that, for example, I had a family member that was killed by a drunk driver, and then I go hunt this individual down and kill him, that's murder. You understand the difference? Well, the reason why that it was so important to have cities of refuge, a total of 54 cities, 6 for that specific purpose, 48 that were Levitical cities that anybody could go in where the Levites had the control of the cities, was to avoid having blood spilled in the country. One of the things that we learn in Torah law, very profound. When you read the Torah, it seems to be quite prejudiced when it comes to serving up justice. It's like they seemed eager to stone people or to hang them or to kill them. And then we find out from the sages of blessed memory who say that if a Sanhedrin would have one death penalty conviction in 70 years, it was considered a court of blood. I mean, that's a profound idea, which means that in the state of Israel, rarely was anybody ever committed to the death penalty. Why? Because there was such a stringent level to avoid spilling innocent blood. Now, you would say, well, how is somebody who had committed murder, how is that death penalty innocent blood? The idea is that Hashem says that even though the Sanhedrin has the restrictions of the law, what if by chance there is the possibility that that person did not kill somebody on purpose? And yet all of the evidence against them says that it was intentional. And you do put him to death. Now the nation is responsible for the innocent blood that they have poured out onto the ground. Very profound idea. So, to kill someone not guilty of murder is actually an act of revenge, and for an accidental death is, once we said, is absolutely abhorrent to God. This is why we have to have the safe havens. Now, the prevention of unjust violence is fundamental to Torah law. God's covenant with Noah and mankind after the flood identifies murder as an ultimate crime. It's one of the 7 Noahide laws. He who sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God created man. Genesis 9:6. So blood wrongly shed cries to heaven itself. God said to Cain after he was murdered, Abel, your blood's brother is crying from the ground. Genesis 41:10. Now, I'm going to read the next text, and then I'm going to digress a little bit on a thought that I need to address because it's been addressed to me over several texts in the last couple of weeks. Here in Bemidbar, Numbers 35:13, it says, "And you shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood who shed the blood." The verb that appears twice in this verse is nowhere else in Mosaic books. Means to pollute, to soil, to dirty, to defile. There is something fundamentally blemished about a world in which murder goes unpunished. Human life is sacred. Even justified acts of bloodshed, as in case of war, still communicate impurity. For example, a Kohen, a priest who sheds blood, cannot give the priestly blessing. It's impossible. Why? Because he has blood on his hands. Even David Amelech, who wanted to build the temple, King David wanted to build the temple. Why was he not allowed to build the temple? Because he was a warrior, he shedded blood. So the idea is, though we do believe, in the Torah law very much states that a person who murders is liable to be put to death by execution, but because of the restrictions of Torah law, which means that someone had to witness the murder, right? And it had to be two individuals who are of impeccable Torah righteousness to bring witness against this person. If there are no witnesses, they cannot be convicted by circumstantial evidence. Interesting. Only in this country can we get up and have two criminals that are serving life sentences speak against someone who's been in prison, waiting for trial, and use that testimony of other criminals to justify putting another man to death. It happens all the time. Now, how do I want to digress? I had someone mention the other day, a very beautiful person, a very God-fearing and seeking individual, who is not part of our community, who was asking the question about blood atonement and how important it is, their concept of how important blood atonement is. And they had quoted this verse from Genesis 9:6 that said that your brother's blood is crying from the ground. And it's the idea that God hears the cry, the cry of the blood from the ground, and therefore forgives the sins of people because of blood shed. And that is totally opposite in what the Torah teaches. First of all, God would say that any blood shed with intention is an abomination and pollutes the land. Why would the Creator of the universe require the blood of a man to forgive you when merely you can repent of your sins? Because what happens when a man is killed and murdered maliciously, it pollutes the land. It doesn't do anything to change anybody's sins. It pollutes the land. And that's what the Torah says. That's a very big thing to have to swallow and understand for an individual. And so when someone says the blood is crying out, yes, the blood cries out, but the blood cries out because it cries out for judgment to take place. Now, let me address this. Why was Cain not judged to death? Do we know? Why was he not committed to death? Because he didn't know he killed somebody. Didn't know what murder was. Had no idea. He was angry, and that's why he said, "What? My brother's keeper? Where do I know he's at?" How did he know that hitting him in the head with a rock or whatever he did was going to kill him? They had never seen a murder up to this point. So the whole idea is God brought judgment upon him, but did not bring the judgment of death because, first of all, the Torah law from Sinai was not in existence yet. There was a oral law that was given to Adam, to their children. No one knew what murder was. What is behind the idea of revenge? Let's think about this for a second. We're living in a culture right now in which we see ISIS on the warpath. And many of the ISIS leaders are here to avenge the death and the defamation of their prophet Muhammad. The battles that took place in France a few months ago, was about the defaming of their prophet Muhammad, and people were murdered. Revenge, death. Revenge killing is absolutely against the law of God, period. Period. With that being said, there is this idea of the Geol Hadam, which actually is wrongly translated in most texts, that says blood avenger. It means, in fact, blood redeemer. A redeemer is someone who signs an imbalance in the world, who rescues someone or something and restores it to its original place, its rightful place. For example, Boaz redeems the land that belongs to Naomi. A redeemer is one who restores a relative to freedom after they have been forced to sell themselves into slavery. There's the bondsman redeemer, right? God redeems his people from bondage of Egypt. A blood redeemer is one who ensures that murderers does not go unpunished, which means that if you know that a family member has been murdered intentionally, you pursue that. Now, there is a law that protects that individual. He can run into a city of refuge, until which time a judge and a court could look at the case. And man, if they look at the case and the evidence, and there are witnesses that says that he intentionally murdered the person, and they have the evidence, he's kicked out of the city and obviously taken into judgment. There's an act of killing. However, there are not all acts of killing are murder. How about a car accident? Is that a murder? No. How about if you're intoxicated and you murder and you kill somebody? Is that still murder? No. It's vehicular homicide, but it's not murder. Unintentional. How about the woman who ran over her husband and ex-husband in the parking lot of the hotel a few years ago? Claire Harris. What is that? Murder? Yeah. We all remember that well, don't we? I don't even know who told me this story, and if you told me this story, I'm sorry. But anyway, somebody says that they had a friend of theirs that was in the system, in the prison system, and was going through like group therapy sessions. And this family member sat down and they went around the corner, ran around the thing and says, I'm so-and-so, I've had 25 years in for this, and I'm so-and-so. And it came almost to her, and the lady next to her, and the lady next to her says, I'm Clara Harrison, and I'm here for murder. And she said the family member got up and walked to the other side of the room and was like, I am not sitting next to her. And mind you, everybody in that room were murderers, right? This person was like, I am not sitting next to that person. So it's funny. Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to sit next to her. Here the emphasis is on protection. But on the other, we read that if the exiled person ever goes outside of the limits of the city of refuge to which they have fled, the Redeemer of blood finds them outside of the city. The Redeemer of blood may kill the accused without being guilty. Wow, that's hard for us to even comprehend. Without being accused of murder. That is the little catch. Now, if you did that today, well, it means this. If a person's let's use an example. A brother finds out that his brother was killed by a stone wall that was being built by another man. And the stone wall fell over and killed him. The guy that the stone wall fell over, that was building the wall that it fell over, he runs for his life because he realized, I know his brother, and his brother will kill me for this, even though it was an accident. So he runs to the city of refuge, and there he's given refuge. But for some reason, he decides to leave and go visit his parents on the holiday weekend. if he's found by this other brother who's still very angry, and that brother in his anger kills the other man, he cannot be found guilty of murder. And the details on that is found in verse 26 through 27 of Numbers 35th chapter.
The redeemer of blood must be somebody out there that this guy committed this crime.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be a family member.
Yes. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I would think so. And the thing is this makes this law very weird and mysterious. Does that make sense? It just makes it a little unusual. Like, okay, we can't have revenge killing. Then how is it that you're going to allow that if a person is able to escape? If they escape and you kill them, how is that not a revenge killing? That is one of the loopholes in this whole system. Being the fact that the person who does this act is considered a blood redeemer. He's actually redeeming his brother's blood by killing another person. That is an old ancient Middle Eastern idea which still lives today. Thank God not in Israel, but in the rest of the Middle East. We can see the difference by looking how the Talmud in Maimonides explains the provisions that the exile must stay in the city of the refuge until the death of the high priest. What had the high priest to do with accidental killing? According to the Talmud, the high priest would have to should have asked for mercy. He should have prayed that there would be no accidental deaths among the people, and he did not do so. The assumption is that the high priest prayed more fervently and God would not have allowed the accident to happen, meaning at some level the high priest is responsible at Yom Kippur for having not prayed fervently enough for murders not to take place and killings to not take place. So the idea is that the high priest is now responsible for you. If you're being chased down for murder, you're responsible. That high priest is responsible for you. And until he cries out for your mercy, you're going to have to stay in his protection if God didn't give mercy to the accident. So that means that until the high priest dies, you're stuck.
So now we're
Still stuck. Could be 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years. Just hope the high priest is old when you run into the city of refuge. That's all there is to it. The assumption is that the high priest prayed more fervently. We talked about the assumption is that he did his job, but he's now saying, I've done my job, murder's taking place, I'm going to take responsibility for you. It's like putting the responsibility of innocent blood being shed on the responsibility of the Cohens and the Levites. They had to be responsible to make sure that this did not take place. Interesting idea. Maimonides, however, gives a completely different explanation in the Guide to Perplexed. He says, for him that the issue at stake is not atonement but protection. The reason the man goes into exile in the city of refuge is to allow the passion of the relatives' victims to subside. So at some point during the next few years, hopefully they will have come to their senses and realize it's not worth revenge. And usually time does heal those kinds of wounds. The desire for revenge is a basic trait of all societies, even us in this room. If we had somebody that we loved dearly that was molested or hurt, you would want revenge. You would most definitely want revenge. And if you've ever experienced having someone that you know of that has been molested or maligned in any way, you would most definitely want to take revenge. Though we wouldn't, we would want to. The Torah understands that the desire for revenge is a natural part of our human inclination. And the idea is it recognizes this pain and the loss and moral indignation that the family and the victim of the family would feel. That is the meaning of the phrase of the Redeemer of blood or blood redeemer. The figure who represents that in that instinct for revenge. The Torah legislates for people with all their passions, not of saints, but of a realistic code. I mean, sure, it would be a great world in which you could say there's not going to be any murder. There's just not going to be it. Nobody's going to have this opportunity to murder. Bottom line, no revenge killing. But the problem is this, is if you were to put that on people, you're not recognizing that humans are humans. And humans have this desire, and there have been people who have committed crimes of passion on many different occasions, right? Yet the Torah inserts one vital element between the killer and the victim's family. The killer must be protected until his case has been heard in a court of law. If found guilty, he must pay the price. If found innocent, he must be given refuge. This single act turns revenge into retribution. This makes all the difference. So the idea would be this. It's almost like witness protection program. Think about that. It's the best way to describe it. Meaning the guy who is innocent of this could very well be hunted down for the rest of his life. And to protect him from this, he goes into the city of a refuge. People often find it difficult to distinguish between retribution and revenge. Yet they are completely different concepts. Revenge is what they call an I-thou relationship. And the killer, you killed a member of my family, so I will kill you. It is intrinsically personal. Retribution, by contrast, is impersonal. It's no longer the one individual having a vested interest in bringing about some type of justice. It's now someone blinded by their anger and frustration and hatred toward another person that they commit this murder. We've heard of blood feuds that have existed even in this country between the Hatfields and McCoys. Started off as a horrible execution of several members of a family and led to several decades of a blood feud between families. We hear back in Europe within the Scottish culture of clans having blood feuds between the clans. This is always sort of part and parcel of being a human being. But God's law protects an individual from having to go through that kind of stress in which he is innocent of a crime and to be killed. Why was that so important? Because blood poured out, and innocent blood poured out in the land of Israel, polluted the land. And if the land was polluted, therefore the presence or the Shekinah of Hashem would at some point have to be withdrawn from a polluted land. Obviously, this is not ancient history. This whole idea of trials and retributions and justice, we think of the Holocaust. Many of the camp leaders were taken out and hung immediately, didn't even have a trial. Didn't know if you're aware of that. Now, many of them did have trials and then eventually were taken and hung. And one sense of justice was the leader of Auschwitz. Help me. I'll think of it in a second. But he was hung actually on the same gallows that he hung many Jews. Very interesting. Just a few yards away from his house, where his children literally played in the yard while ashes fell on them. And they were completely unaware of what was going on.
They just found a 94-year-old count guilty.
Yes. And it's interesting because they gave him 4 years in prison. Why 4 years? He's 94 years old. It's a life sentence. To me, I mean, that's one of those deals. So this chief moral obstacle to the path of reconciliation is a desire for revenge. Now, revenge is commonly regarded as a low and unworthy emotion because it is regarded as such. Its deep moral hold on people is rarely understood. But revenge, morality is considered. It is a desire of deep faith with deed to honor their memory, to take up their cause where they left off. Revenge keeps faith between generations. The violence it engenders is a ritual form of respect for a community's dead. Therein lies legitimacy. Reconciliation is difficult precisely because it must compete with a powerful alternative, morality of violence. Political terror is tenuous because it is an ethical practice. It is a cult of the dead and dire and absolute expression of respect. This is what happens when you have this tear between retribution and justice. It's a hard thing to differentiate between. We have societies today. As a matter of fact, right now, I think that if you were to nail down ISIS, they would be saying, well, we're merely doing what the Christians did to us. And it'd be easy for Christians to rise up and say, well, we're going to do it to you because of what you did to me. And it's a tough place to be. But what do we learn from this whole idea of to catch a killer? When is it appropriate to, according to Torah law, to hunt a person down and to bring them to justice? When they've committed a murder, a legitimate murder. But one is not justified to kill another human being without due process of the law. Now, we also are not saying that person cannot protect themselves. We're not talking about somebody sneaks into your house, assuming that if a person snuck into your house with a bolo knife, they're wanting to die. If they sneak into my house anyway. Anybody else's house, I'm not sure. But if they come into your house, they're assuming the responsibility that they're going to be judged, tried, and executed at the same time. Right? But at the same moment, someone asked the other day, should you shoot somebody that's looting your house? Right? That's a question. You shoot somebody that's looting your house? I don't know that if I really have anything in that house besides, let's say my house is empty. Is there anything in my house worth killing a human being over? Really, no. I mean, that's my personal opinion. Even though the state law says that you have the right to defend your property, especially if that property leads to your personal financial demise. But I would have a very difficult time killing a guy with my stupid car. I mean, if you want a car, fine. You can have it. But it's different if you're going to take my wife or my grandchildren. See the big difference.
But it's also different if you're in the car and he's trying to open your door and you don't know what.
Don't know his motives behind it. Right, absolutely. So the idea of sanctuary cities teach us two very valuable things about our God. All the Torah teaches us about God, but this teaches us one thing, is first, that a person who does commit a murder is going to be tried and should be tried, but it should be tried according to Torah law. And this is in Israel. We're not talking about our state and federal laws. That a person commits murder should stand and be responsible even to their own death, according to the law. But it needs to be the strict standards of the Torah law says that it has to be called, proper witnesses, etc. Second, the city of refuge teaches us that if someone does commit an act of killing another person, they don't have to worry about their own life. There is a place for them to have protection. They don't have to be looking over their shoulder all the time. And the reason why is because God does not want innocent blood to be shed upon his land. That concludes the lecture.